Okay, hey everybody. Oh, I just got the recording in progress and I have to hit got it before I can move on. Yes. And I see I'm not having a full day. I don't know if everybody else has had a full day. I haven't been told I'm on mute yet. So here, do me a favor. I'm going to unmute. Now my day, I've had a regular pandemic day. So thanks for everybody for coming. You are in the right spot. If you are coming to ConCon and Conversations with Stephen Bissette, Comics Go to College. We will have 3 left after this session. And I'll just tell you what those are. Next time is Comics Prehistory. Then we have Comics Technology 101. And we'll be ending with early Afrofuturism and comics is the last session. And within there, we're going to have a couple of giveaways. There are some winners in the house that have already won something. So we've got several signed things left. And then I think Stephen also said that he may send us a few little comic bits and pieces that he's going to sign for us too, in addition to some of the books. So we'll do those probably the last 2 sessions and get those out to folks. And we did send out an email earlier in the week, just making sure that people have been receiving their winnings. So we've had people respond positively. So we're glad that you're here. We are so glad to be here with Stephen Bissette. I learned so much each time that I'm with Stephen. Like, I've been collecting comics for probably 30 or 40 years. And every time he talks, I'm like, what? How did I miss that? So it's always enjoyable, and I'm so glad that you could join us. We are Jackson ConCon. This is one of our last set of events for the year in our lead up to our October convention. And you can check us out on jacksonconcon.org. And we have pre-recorded lectures that Stephen has already given on a variety of subjects. Our partners in this endeavor are Jackson College, of course, is the kind of the parenting sponsor of stuff. Then we have Jackson District Library, which is our series of libraries in Jackson County. And then we also have Nostalgia Inc., which is our local comic shop. And they are sponsoring the next 2 in the series. So with that being said, I just want to introduce, this is I'm just a regular dude. I'm the only non-professor in the joint. And I'll introduce the couple of the let the professors introduce themselves from Jackson College. So ST, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Steve Tuckey. I am a professor at Jackson College. I teach physics and science and statistics and calculus and all kinds of fun stuff that everybody at a party will just back away from me slowly when I tell them that I teach it. But one of my favorite things to do at the college is to work with the Concatenation Convention, which myself and my colleague, Stephen L.B. Scott, had started years ago, along with John Hart. So welcome, Steve, take it away.
Well, my name's Stephen Albee Scott, and like Stephen Tuckey, I teach at Jackson College, and it is my honor to be here, because I just love the fact that we actually got this off the ground. Considering when we started, we went, John, do you think we can do this? And John's like, yeah, sure, why not? And this was really just done on a shoestring, and we've had incredible speakers across the board. And Stephen, by no measure, you've blown my mind more this year than I think in all of the ConCon events that we've had, just because the detail of information you have. But anyway, welcome, and I'll turn it back over to John. So John, do your thing.
Yeah, last announcements is just that please keep any questions when you come up with them when we have break germane to the topic. This is about basically therapy or healing through the graphics medium. And then I'm told we're also going to have a little bit of stuff in the end about Swamp Thing specifically after the break. We will have a break where you can ask questions. Please, like they said, keep muted throughout the thing so we don't bother anybody else. And then if you put questions in the chat, I will monitor them. And if they're germane to a point that comes up right away, I'll interject them there, or at the end of each session, I'll make sure that they get addressed. So we are so glad to have you here. Thank you so much for being here. And I'm going to turn it over to Stephen Bissette.
Evening all, and Happy New Year, one and all.
Happy New Year.
Yeah, given whatever's coming up for us all in 2022. Hey, we made it this far. I also need to add, John, you are not the only non-professor. I am not a professor either. Okay, I was instructor at the Center for Cartoon Studies for 15 plus years, but I do not have a degree in anything. 2 years at Johnson State College studying art and theater, 2-year certificate from the Joe Kubert School. That is my college level academic credentials, and teaching 15 plus years at the Center for Cartoon Studies. That said, you know, maybe some college out there will grant me an honorary PhD one day. I mean, who knows? Stranger things have happened. I watch famous friends of mine, like Neil Gaiman and others, you know, getting awarded all kinds of crazy shit, and they have fewer academic credentials than I have, so you never know. Anyway, tonight's lecture is very much academic in nature. And I usually try to maintain a modicum of eye contact with you all, staring at the green dot or glancing at the green dot. This is a note-heavy presentation I'm delivering to you all tonight. It is a 2-part presentation. We will take a break for Q&A, and it'll give those of you who need, what are they calling it now? Well, it's an old term, I guess, bio break, but it's my least favorite word of 2022 already. During that interim, the first part of this lecture is called Pencil Me In, and it's an overview of some of the thesis projects that were presented at the Center for Cartoon Studies that were autobiographical in nature and specifically concerned various conditions, situations, health crises that the students who created these thesis projects were dealing with or had been dealing with much or most of their lives. I specifically reached out to a group of 5 of the Center for Cartoon Studies alumni, and all of them very graciously gave me permission to include their work in this presentation to you all, and gave permission for it to be recorded and archived online. So special thanks to those creators who I will name as we go through their work, and again at the end. Then there'll be a short break, and part 2 tonight is a Swamp Thing specific lecture concerning whether Alan Moore, John Toddleben, and myself using an autistic character in one of our Swamp Thing stories was a case of exploration or exploitation. And it seems to me that is relevant in these questions about graphic medicine. The graphic medicine term is one that has been used by academia now for, I think, at least 12, if not more years. There are annual graphic medicine conferences now that occur in different parts of the world. I have been fortunate enough to attend and participate in 2 of those. And this is a very steadily growing branch of comics creation, graphic novel creation, and academic studies. And I also hasten to add that a number of medical institutions have very actively engaged with graphic medicine as a tool, both as a means of communicating within various medical institutions, where more and more of them are using comics as a way to communicate very sometimes hard information within their community, and also connecting with those creators who have been getting work out there, getting work published that has ended up resonating in some pretty fascinating ways. So I hope you'll enjoy this 2-part presentation. If you make it through part 1, I promise you some monsters in part 2, if I need to hit that note. So again, please pardon me that I will be spending part of my time, you know, adhering to my notes. It does not mean I am not attentive or paying attention to you. And once we get to the Q&A, I'll be right back here for square. So without further ado, let me see if I can set up my screen in such a way that it will allow me. Bingo. Okay, now let me know, are you seeing the title Pencil Me In? Is that visible to everyone?
Yep.
Great. Okay, here we go. Pencil Me In, the process and practice of graphic medicine, specifically as I saw it materialize in real time at the Center for Cartoon Studies. This is a portion, not the complete talk, but this is a portion of a lecture I presented at the 2018 Graphic Medicine Conference when it was co-sponsored by the Center for Cartoon Studies and Dartmouth College. And if you're interested in reaching out to any of these individuals, please contact me either through the contact information at Jackson College with Stephen Tuckey and Professor Albie Scott, and they'll get in touch with me and we'll go from there. Here we go, without further ado. This is a quote from the co-founder of the Center for Cartoon Studies, graphic novelist James Sturm. And as this quote is up here and you make your way through it, I'll talk a bit about my experience as well. As an instructor at the Center for Cartoon Studies, since CCS first opened its doors in the summer of 2005, I've been privileged to witness and at times participate in the creative process that various cartoonists of all ages have put themselves through to complete various autobiographical comics and graphic novel works involving their own personal health issues, past and or present. And with the very kind permission of a representative core group of these creators, I'm honored to offer here to all of you an illustrated overview of the path, the perils, and the potential inherent in the creation of such intensely intimate and introspective works. I'm going to start with a public work, something that was not specific to CCS. Ken Dahl won a number of industry awards for his serialized graphic novel Monsters. I got to know Ken through his being a CCS fellow for the year 2007 to 2008. I interviewed Ken back in 2007 for my blog, and he said, quote, "For me, drawing confessional comics has always been something like luscious revulsion you experience while opening a carton of cottage cheese that you know has been in the back of the fridge for months and months and months. Only that carton is my brain. If someone has no desire to gaze upon whatever's waiting inside that carton, they must be a pretty dull person. And who knows, maybe under that wet skin of toxic spores, there's actually a band of magic dwarves jamming on theremins and standing on an ingot of solid gold." Of course, all this isn't to say the comics I drew as a result of these beliefs were any good, but I did what I could and had a real curiosity about my own messed upness and a drive to improve both my comics and my brain. Basically, I've been painfully shy and awkward my whole life, and connecting with other humans has been an immense challenge. Autobiographical comics were a way of getting some relief from that. When I draw comics and people read them, it makes me feel like I exist and I'm not just a drooling, mealy-mouthed, chuckle-headed idiot, and maybe I'm even a worthwhile human being, which is definitely not the impression that I usually give off in person, nor how I felt for most of my life. Here's some images from Monsters. Monsters is an account of Gabby's struggle with herpes. Quote, "When I was drawing Monsters #1 at the table of my house truck, I took it for granted that it would meet the same fate as everything else I've drawn. A few people would read it, a few copies would gather dust on a zine rack somewhere, and that would be the end of it. If you had told me then that in a few months I was going to have to accept an Ignatz Award for it," Gabby won the Ignatz Award for Monsters in 2006. Back to Gabby's quote, "I would have laughed and laughed. In fact, I'm still laughing. I have no idea how that happened. I do have one guess about how I won the Ignatz. Everyone who had herpes at the SPX voted for Monsters to win the Ignatz. That's a lot of people. According to the Centers for Disease Control, 50 to 80% of American adults have type 1 herpes. 21% have type 2. And more than 2/3 of these people don't even have symptoms. I guess that was the point of drawing a comic about herpes. I had gone through so much misery and confusion about this virus that drawing a comic about it was a way to make sense of it, both for myself and for other people who knew as little as I did about it. I was really angry that I heard nothing about this virus until my early 30s, and then only because my partner had an outbreak. So I wanted to make sure that other people didn't have to go through the same bullshit as me, only learning about herpes the hard way after they got it themselves, or worse, gave it to someone else. It seemed like a good use for comics. I could use monsters as a cheap, easy way of forcing people to think about something they otherwise probably wouldn't. Like chick tracts, only not insane. Gabby's referring to the Jack T. Chick Christian comic tracts, best known as chick tracts. I'm quoting Gabby again. First of all, writing about herpes meant telling everyone who read my comic book that I had herpes. So before I could write about it, I had to force myself to get over my own embarrassment at having the virus, which was extremely hard at first and took a lot of research and forcing myself not to be a chicken shit. I think my history of drawing about uncomfortable subjects really helped me through this stuff. And in the process of doing all that and educating myself about the disease, I found that my embarrassment and shame had been replaced by a fascination with, even an admiration for, herpes and viruses in general, and all the weird ways they've learned to coexist with humans and other higher forms of life. In some ways, they're a lot smarter than we are. They just multiply, and they let us do all the footwork. They've pared everything down to a streamlined simplicity. If the point of life is to propagate our DNA, then viruses are the undisputed champions of evolution, which makes sense as they've been around a lot longer than most anything else on this planet. So you can see by what I'm writing here that once a virus is in you, they not only become a part of you, you become a part of them too. It's a weird world. Now, this is very relevant, not just to the pandemic that we're all, every one of us on this planet, currently in the middle of, but it's also relevant to the comics I'm about to share with you all tonight. It tells you a little bit about the process that goes into the creation of these comics and graphic novels I'll be sharing with you. It's worth noting, as Gabby did, I'm quoting Gabby again, quote, "It was really hard to draw. I mean, I literally spent most of the time at the drawing board not actually drawing, but just sulking, paralyzed over how to plot out these miserable interactions. To draw something out well, I have to mull over every little tiny part of it, every hand gesture and sweat bead. So when I'm drawing traumatic or depressing situations, it can be just a huge bummer," unquote. And I have to say, that was something that I was sensitive to as an instructor. And I would often warn seniors at the Center for Cartoon Studies who undertook this kind of work as their thesis project, that they should be sure that this was going to be a process they would be able to handle. Because my desire for all of the seniors at the Center for Cartoon Studies, all the students at CCS, was that they would graduate, that they would finish the program successfully. And there's a reason I predominantly draw fantasy comics, right? Whatever psychoanalysis or personal analysis I may do is usually sublimated in the form of the fantasy stories that I choose to write, draw, or collaborate with others on. And I will be engaging with that after our break when I share with you the process of one of our Swamp Thing story arcs and how that turned into an adventure in self-analysis and even a little bit of precognition, if you will. So what Gabby is sharing with us here and talking about how difficult the process was of doing his graphic novel Monsters is relevant to everything I'm about to share with you tonight. On his own blog, Kendall/Gabby, Gabby was his nickname, noted concerning his subsequent graphic novel, Sick, quote, "Sick began in 2011 as chunks of impromptu comic posts on his website. When I started chronicling a mystery illness I just suffered while living in Flatbush. I didn't have a plan or an endpoint for the comic," unquote. By the way, both Monsters and Sick are still in print. And if after the lecture or even during the lecture, you're free to go online and order things. I cannot recommend either or both of these more highly. These are really important works of North American comics. Of course, they're not particularly upbeat, and I don't know if it's the kind of thing you're going to want to be reading during an international pandemic, but that's up to you. Continuing the quote with Gabby, quote, like most things I draw, it was just compulsive depiction of a painful experience that left me a bit shaken in questioning a few of my life's fundamental assumptions. Since I usually don't have anyone to talk to about this and can't afford therapy, things like monsters and sick happen, almost as a byproduct of me just trying to make sense of life. And the fact of the matter is part of why graphic medicine, and this is me talking to you now, part of why graphic medicine is proliferating as a genre right now is that more and more creative people are using the medium of comics as a means of therapy, self-therapy. A number of them have the benefit of living in parts of the world where there are effective healthcare systems and where they are able to get actual counseling and therapy as well as medical aid. But others of us, like those of us in the third world country of the United States of America, have miserable healthcare. And I cannot tell you how many of the students at CCS who tackled this kind of work were really doing it as a form of self-therapy. Let me bring to your attention a graphic novelist by the name of Manny Murphy. And before I get into the work at hand relevant to this lecture, I want to highly recommend Manny Murphy's brand new graphic novel published by Fantagraphics called I Never Promised You a Rose Garden. It is an amazing semi-autobiographical, but largely historical overview of aspects of living in Portland, Oregon, and what's been going on there, not just in the news that we all were made painfully aware of over the past 3 years regarding Portland, but also what led to the spread of fascism and the rerouting of white supremacy into parts of American culture. Be that as it may, that again is a graphic novel called I Never Promised You a Rose Garden. Manny Murphy's work that I want to talk about here tonight grew out of Manny's being part of the class of 2008 at the Center for Cartoon Studies. Manny has been exploring similar terrain as that which Gabby Schultz did with Monsters and Sick, including in published comics work that appeared in zines like When Language Runs Dry. The zine When Language Runs Dry is specifically comprised of articles, poetry, art, and occasionally comics. In an as yet unpublished interview that Manny and I did, Manny told me, quote, zine culture is so important to me for this reason. I'm really in love with publishers who are bridging zine work with small publishing work. I feel like it's helping to keep print alive and thriving, unquote. And as a matter of fact, Manny's new graphic novel, I Never Promised You a Rose Garden, began and lived out its life initially as a zine format serialized comic, and then was collected and revised by Manny for publication by Fantagraphics. So on the heels of having completed a CCS thesis project called I Still Live, a biographical historical work about a psychic who lived here in Vermont in the 18th and 19th century. And by the way, I Still Live won a Xeric Award. Manny Murphy completed the 12-page story Sick, quote, that I did for the zine When Language Runs Dry, a zine for people with chronic pain and their allies. It was about my invisible disability, and I got a lot of really incredible feedback about it from people with similar experiences. I did this comic before Gabby did his Sick comic. I think he probably never read mine, but I read his, and our experiences were profoundly similar, unfortunately. About this 12-page story, Manny says, quote, putting Sick down on paper was totally therapeutic. I can't deny it. It was also an ordeal. I was staying off the grid out on a friend's land for residency, and my disabilities were severely acting up. I painted a picture of myself sick on the couch surrounded by monsters while I was literally lying sick in a couch essentially on bed rest. Putting the experience of a not always apparent disability down on paper itself was therapeutic. And then the response, which put me into contact with the sick and disabled queer community, was also transformative. Prior to the Center for Cartoon Studies opening its doors, my own direct experience with comics and illness, in this case, a form of mental illness, was during my 2 years at the Joe Kubert School of Cartoon and Graphic Art in Dover, New Jersey. And this is a photo of the Baker Mansion, which is now a dorm for the Joe Kubert School and is still in Dover, New Jersey. But when I attended as a member of the first ever class at the Joe Kubert School, this was our classroom. This was not a dorm. I was a member of the first ever class. Our classes were held at Baker Mansion, and this photo is a photo provided to me by fellow ex-Kubert student Tom Fox-Marnick. The Baker Mansion was the grand heart of my Kubert School experience from September of 1976 to our graduation in the spring of '78 and a little bit beyond. Along with classmates Rick Veach, Tom Yates, and John Toddleman, I co-rented a house in walking distance of the Baker Mansion. And it was from that house that all four of us launched our freelance professional careers. During our second year at the Kubert School, 1977 and 1978, one of our classmates suffered a complete mental collapse. Our classmate began working on an assignment that had been given by one of our instructors, challenged, as most cartoonists are, by the initial blank whiteness of the page, until they'd completely inked a perfectly lovely 4-panel page of comic art with characteristically spare but expressive lines. And I can't show you that comic because it then transformed into what I'm about to show you. Our classmate then continued to apply ink to the finished page until the page became an incomprehensible gray mass. And finally, a completely black page, shellacked with Higgins Black Magic ink. The ink was so thick that it was shiny on the board. This classmate then declared the page done and stared at it for what seemed hours. Needless to say, this worried all of us. This was the first ever class of the Kubert School, and none of us were equipped to deal with what was happening. Thankfully, our oldest classmate at the Kubert School, a wonderful man named Ben Ruiz, sadly no longer with us, but Ben was a godsend to us at the Kubert School. Ben had worked in mental health facilities in New York City, and Ben took charge of the situation. We visited our classmate during their incarceration at Greystone Park Psychiatric Hospital in Morris Plains, New Jersey. This was a facility that opened in 1876. It closed its doors in 1988, and it was demolished in 2015. Our classmates' parents came and took our classmate back to their family home, and we never saw him again. We did stay in touch with him. In fact, Rick Veach and I published some of his subsequent comics work after his recovery. But our classmate sadly passed away about 1.5 years ago. So this was my first brush as an adult with the conjunction between cartooning and some form of disability or mental illness. As a reader, though, I had already had a brush with it. At DC Comics, an amazing writer-artist named Sam Glanzman began his series of autobiographical war stories, and these were tales of Sam Glanzman's service aboard the USS Stevens, serving in the Pacific Theater of World War II. These began appearing as little backup stories, 4 to 8-page backup stories in Our Army at War, number 218, published in April of 1970. I read the first installment while I was in high school. However, I do want to mention that Sam had earlier incorporated his USS Stevens experiences into a few of his early 1960s naval war stories that were published by Charlton Comics. And let me give you kind of a chronological barometer here for those of you who are into comics and comics history. Remember that the underground comic, autobiographical underground comic, It Ain't Me, Babe, published by Last Gasp in 1970, would have seen print the same year as the first appearance of USS Stevens in Our Army at War. Mary Wings's solo autobiographical comic, Come Out Comics, was published in 1972, and Justin Green's incredible classic, Binky Brown Meets the Holy Virgin Mary, was published in 1972, and that was after Justin Brown's earlier solo Binky Brown story in Laugh in the Dark, published by Last Gasp in 1971. Women's comics, which featured a lot of autobiographical self-standing stories, had launched in 1972. And the American cartoonist, actually comics writer, Harvey Pekar, who is usually credited with launching autobiographical comics as a genre, first appeared in a comic called Crazy Ed, which was written by Harvey Pekar, drawn by Robert Crumb, and it was the back cover of Robert Crumb's The People's Comics, which was published in 1972. And then Harvey completed 7 new stories working with other cartoonists between 1975 and 76. And 76, the year I started at Kubert School, was when Harvey Pekar launched American Splendor as an autobiographical comic series. Reflecting the popular view of autobiographical comics history, and for that I look to the Wikipedia entry, Justin Green states, quote, that autobiographical comics are, quote, intense graphic depictions of personal torment. And Wikipedia says that this form had never appeared in comic book form before and had a profound effect on other cartoonists and the future direction of comics as literature, unquote. Well, that's ignoring completely that Sam Glanzman had been there first and that Sam did not do it in black and white underground comics that you had to go searching for. Sam's autobiographical war comics appeared in a mainstream 4-color comic book that reached hundreds of thousands of readers via newsstand sales and via military PX sales. Those Sam Glanzman stories were collected in their entirety in a single hardcover volume from Dover Graphic Novels, and that's the book you've been looking at as I've been talking to you about this aspect of Sam's work. Now, I could go on and on about USS Stevens, but that's not why we're here tonight. What we're here for tonight is graphic medicine, but I do want to bring to your attention one of Sam's stories. It was a story entitled "And Fear Crippled Andy Payne." This was first published in Sergeant Rock number 304 in May of 1977, during my very first year at the Kubert School. Remember too that our mentor at the Kubert School, Joe Kubert, was the editor who solicited, edited, and published Sam's seminal body of autobiographical military comics. I praised this story in print in the first published introduction I ever did involving Sam Glanzman's work. And Sam was so moved that he gifted the original art to this story to me. It's an amazing story. Andy Payne did not see the glamour in war, as did the well-paid journalist writing from behind his typewriter. Andy Payne lived it and saw only death. Andy first saw death while on liberty in Manila. The city hadn't quite cleaned itself up from the wounds of war, and he stumbled onto a charred body in a bombed-out trolley car. So what this story is about, I won't read the entire story to you for reasons of time, is a traumatized young sailor named Andy, who is so traumatized by his wartime experience that when he goes back to the USS Stevens, he decides he's going to do something to change his situation. And he makes his way down into the kitchens, where he goes to the meat locker, uses a cleaver to cut open one of the bundles he's been ordered to pull out. And staring at the cleaver, he decides he's going to check out of this war. And this is the final 2 pages of And Fear Crippled Andy Payne. This is an astonishing work of biography / autobiography. And it is gobsmacking that this was published in a 4-color comic published by DC Comics in 1977. I can no longer say this is an overlooked body of work because that Sam Glanzman USS Stevens hardcover collection has been making its rounds now for a few years. But this is why I consider Sam Glanzman sort of the ground zero in a lot of ways, not just of autobiographical comics in memoir in North American comics, but also with some of his stories really getting into aspects of mental and physical health in ways that no other American cartoonist had at the time. My first wife, Marlene O'Connor, worked in 1983 when I was starting work on Swamp Thing at a now long gone school for autistic children that was called the Green Meadows School of Autism. It was up on Stowe Hill in Wilmington, Vermont. Related anecdote, I will go into specifics of this Swamp Thing story right after our break. I'm just going to touch on this story here in the context of this part of the lecture. Quoting Alan Moore's interview in Comics Interview number 12, published in 1984, Alan said, quote, "Most of the plot is Steve's. His wife, Nancy," by the way, Nancy changed her name to Marlene, unquote, back to Alan, "works in a home for autistic children, such as the one we're using in the story. And the idea of the camera, this creature who feeds on fear, being let loose in their own private universe of fear, was Steve's." Though I penciled many of Marlene's co-workers into the story with their permission, and one of those co-workers, the late Michael Anderson, even drew some of the artwork that appears in this story, and I'll talk a little bit about that after the break. The boy, Paul, who's the protagonist of this 3-part Swamp Thing story, wasn't based on any one autistic use, as that would have been, to my mind, quite unethical and unfair. I did, however, try to capture in Paul a synthesis of characteristics that I had become familiar with from some of the Green Meadow kids. While Marlene was working at Green Meadows, the higher functioning kids were kids that it was okay for us to take out to eat, to occasionally take to a movie. So I got to know a few of the kids fairly well. There was, I tried to capture in the character of Paul a synthesis of some of the characteristics that were familiar to me from a few of those Green Meadows kids. Their androgyny, their beauty, their at times very fierce eyes and expressions, and the odd ways that some of them moved and walked. This page from that Swamp Thing story is a transgressive moment in the run of Swamp Thing. And this somehow survived the Comics Code Authority. This issue was passed by the Comics Code Authority and was published with their seal of approval. And this is a page in which the implication of the form that the camera / Monkey King takes of an adult or an older sibling as a sexual abuser remains chilling. And as it turned out, this may have been the most overt overlap between real world experience in my world and in Marlene's world via her ongoing work with autistic children in Green Meadows School, but it would also prove prescient for both Marlene and I. Starting in 1989 and 1990, Marlene began to suffer with recovered memories of sexual abuse from her childhood, resulting in our 14-year marriage eventually unraveling, although we worked together through the years of therapy and counseling, and we remain very good friends. You can imagine how this image from Swamp Thing afterwards resonated for me throughout the process that Marlene went through and that Marlene and I went through, and how this image still affects me today. For John Totleben, John, at the time he was inking this page, was beginning to deal with physical symptoms that were undiagnosed. here in 1983 and 84. But they were symptoms that had been affecting John since his teenage years into his early 20s and began to come more and more to the fore. And that is, these involved his vision and his hearing. In due time, John Tuttleman was diagnosed with a form of retinitis pigmentosa, but he continued to work in comics for a decade or more. And John still draws to this day, although the kind of workload and deadlines that we used to juggle as a matter of course are now impossible for him. I should add, they're impossible for me too, and I don't have any medical conditions that really impair me regarding my drawing. When I asked John if he ever considered doing a comic about his life story, he said, quote, "Shit, the last thing I want to do when I'm at the drawing board is deal with what I deal with 24/7, unquote. And John also added, and pardon his French, quote, "Fuck that," unquote. We're not of the generation that I'm about to tap you into. Comics and creating comics was an escape for many of us of my generation. However confrontational the genres that we preferred to escape into might have turned out to be, such as my love for horror comics. Alan Moore introduced me to the first post-Binky Brown, Justin Green masterpiece of the graphic novel form. The fact that graphic medicine was becoming an evolving genre became apparent when Alan Moore turned a number of us onto the British cartoonist, writer, filmmaker Al Davison's harrowing autobiographical graphic novel, The Spiral Cage. This was first published in 1988 by Renegade Press. And then Titan Books in the UK published a revised expanded version in 1990. The Absolute edition was published by Active Images in 2003. And if you're going to look for this, I recommend you try to find a copy for yourself of that 2003 edition. Now, at the time Alan Moore first told us of and put us in contact with Al Davison, in fact, Rick Veitch corresponded at some length with Al Davison, he was living in Newcastle. And Al Davison and his wife Maggie now live in Coventry, and they own and manage a comic shop there in Coventry. The Spiral Cage was Al Davison's often terrifying account of his lifelong experience with spina bifida, a genetic and/or environmentally caused nervous system disorder involving an incomplete closure of the backbone and spinal cord's protective membranes that manifests a plethora of symptoms, which Al details in The Spiral Cage in harrowing detail. Davison expanded and explored every possible permutation of what the comic page could do to convey the sensory experience he had endured as fully as possible, overwhelming the attentive reader with an all too vivid account of much of what he endured and how he coped from birth into his adult life. I note Spiral Path here because it's difficult to imagine a more expansive, definitive ground zero if you're going to go for a first reading of the graphic medicine genre, such as it is. This is a very key, well-known work, and the graphic novel and documentary film were both featured earlier in 2018 in the University of North Texas Library's U.S. National Library of Medicine's book, Graphic Medicine, Ill-Conceived and Well-Drawn. Okay, we're finally up to the topic tonight. That was my long drawn out introduction for you all. So I have secured the permission of these 4 alumni from the Center for Cartoon Studies, 5 counting Manny Murphy, whose work I already discussed with you tonight. Nomi Kane from the class of 2011, Joanna McDermott from the class of 2013, Bryn Adams, class of 2015, and Al B. Wesolowski from the class of 2009. The age differentiation between these alumni is great, from having come into the school in their late teens to our oldest graduate, Al B. Wesolowski, who was in his 60s when he came to the Center for Cartoon Studies, saying to me when I asked him during the first few weeks of our work together in the classroom, what prompted you to come here from Boston University, where you're a professional archaeologist, Al? And he said, well, I always wanted to be a cartoonist when I grow up. Okay, so let's take a look at Nomi Kane's work first. Nomi Kane's thesis project included a number of chapbooks and comics. Many times our students' thesis projects are a collective of individual works rather than a singular work. And Nomi's thesis included a crash course educational comic on type 1 diabetes, for those of us not in the know. But Nomi's primary thesis project was an autobiographical account entitled Sugar Baby. This was a carefully, lovingly crafted first-person account of Nomi's childhood and adolescent awakening and adjustment to her having type 1 diabetes, and all that adapting to life as a diabetic at such a tender age entailed. Here's some quotes from Nomi from our conversation about the project. And again, I'm sharing this work with you and these quotes with you with the permission of each of these creators. And I'm sharing the quotes with you with the permission of each of these creators. Nomi said, quote, I started with memory. That's a particularly vivid period for me, even decades later. And then I double checked things with my parents, who were a huge part of this project. Nomi again, quote, I did go back and dig up the old texts on managing type 1 diabetes that I was given by my doctors at the time. And it reminded me how much progress has been made on treatment since then, and how deeply uncool adults try to write hip explainers for kids, and how bad they were back then. Now, Sugar Baby was not only a dramatization of the personal and the family situations revolving around Nomi's diabetes, but also the misperceptions and the kind of shaming those outside her family attached to the dietary and life restrictions and changes. Here's another key 3-panel sequence. I asked Nomi how her family reacted to the completed thesis project. And Nomi said, quote, ultimately, this is a story about my family supporting me in a scary and permanent situation none of us predicted. So they loved it. I think I painted a pretty accurate portrait of them from a young point of view. In this work, Nomi also provides a snapshot of how poor the communication tools were and are for young children, pre-adolescents, and adolescents who are dealing with diabetes. Nomi says, quote, I wish there'd been some thoughtful comics about my condition available to me then, unquote. And I have to say that Nomi's Sugar Baby goes quite some way toward providing a possible template for viable alternatives to the only stuff that was available to her as she was growing up. It's interesting to note as well that one of the turning points for Nomi in her personal experience was finally finding an explanatory chart which featured a familiar cartoon character, the Pink Panther, that helped her make sense of her own body's needs, rhythms, and limitations, which she could then quite handily interpret directly to match her own needs, feelings, and limitations. It's a Gestalt moment that emphasizes how even the most dogmatic, or should I say in the case of Pink Panther, catmatic, diagrams can be enlivened and personalized with the application of comics iconography, of cartoon iconography. And it lends an unexpectedly useful tool to anyone struggle with health concerns or conditions. Quoting Nomi again, quote, I think if I'd drawn this from my perspective now as an adult, there are some more nuanced moments I would have included. But at the time, I felt totally supported by my family, even in the midst of being totally freaked out by my new reality. And that's what I wanted to capture in Sugar Baby. Still quoting Nomi, quote, I think after I finished Sugar Baby, I was more comfortable talking about living with type 1 diabetes than I'd ever been before. As a teenager and in my early 20s, I took pains to hide it from people. I never wanted to be seen as different or unwell. I didn't want people worrying about me. It was the last thing I wanted to talk about with anyone, unquote. Know me again, quote, I still have little waves of rage when strangers dispense unsolicited advice about managing my diabetes or insist they know the cause or the cure for type 1 diabetes. Really? How fascinating. Please share that with researchers immediately. But I feel more empowered to speak up for myself and more part of the emerging community of people with pre-existing conditions uniting against our abusive healthcare system now. When I asked Nomi, quote, in hindsight, knowing what you now know these years later, what would you have done differently? What do you consider work done precisely as you now know you needed to have done it, unquote. And Nomi replied to my question, quote, my drawing has improved a lot since then. So I think I'd redraw it if I could go back in time. And I think I try to include something that addresses the high level of privilege that allowed me to access treatment and education. This is still Nomi, I'm quoting. Quote, being diagnosed with type 1 diabetes in an upper middle class white family in the Bay Area gives you a lot of advantages that people lower down the economic ladder, POC, and people living in rural areas don't get. As a kid, I don't think I ever thought about that. But as an adult who's met lots of other type 1 diabetes from lots of different places, the difference is really acute. I also would have rethought the title. Please don't Google Sugar Baby, whatever you do, unquote. And please take Nomi's advice on that. Joyanna did a thesis project entitled Long Division, and this tackles an even more entangled and introspective life story. Joyanna says, quote, my mentor was Nate Powell, and he was very supportive and understanding when talking about the deeply personal nature of the story. He was the one who suggested turning it into a fictional work based on my life. Quoting Joyanna, quote, that completely shook me out of a rut and made me focus on what was important, chuck all that was unnecessary, and tell a good story. Just because it happened doesn't mean it fits into an engaging narrative. Joyanna's story involved an internal, emotional, psychological, and physiological battle that involved a constant feeling of extreme isolation and disconnect, culminating in a suicide attempt that led to organ damage and further medical and mental health consequences. I asked Joyanna, quote, did the process of telling your story via comics function as a means of self-analysis or self-therapy? Was it arduous in and of itself or therapeutic to externalize the ordeals you'd survived working with your writing and art, unquote? And Joyanna replied, quote, there were times when the act of creating was cathartic and healing. I had blamed myself, the people around me, the environment I was in, blamed everything for my breakdown. Joyanna still, quote, by finding a story in all that mess, helped me let go of the blame and accept it as an event in my life. There were also times that felt almost too hard to handle. Still quoting Joyanna, this is, by the way, just a remarkable image from this work. Joyanna said, quote, drawing a scene, the one I'm showing you here, that involved writing all the negative thoughts that used to plague me constantly had a physical effect on me. I could only work on it for 20 to 30 minutes at a time because it was so painful, unquote. Quoting Joyanna again, Quote, another incredibly hard experience was working on the part of the story where in real life I was unconscious. I asked my best friend to write about her experience during that time. The document she sent me sat unread for 2 years before I could face it. It was a raw account of how my mental breakdown affected the people closest to me. And it was one of the most brutal emotional reads I've ever had, unquote. Now, the 2-year time frame Joanna is referring to is indicative of the kind of work that Joanna had done in preparation before tackling this thesis project, and the work that continued afterwards to complete the portions of Long Division, the title of this work, that were in outline form in the thesis package itself, and then finished later for publication. I should also mention at this point that a number of our Center for Cartoon Studies seniors will sometimes turn in an incomplete thesis project, but they may still pass their senior year, which is an MFA program. If they have the prior degrees, it's an MFA. If they don't have the prior degrees, they get a 2-year certificate. If that incomplete thesis project shows sufficient completion to fully tell the story and make it clear that a full year of work had gone into the project. In some cases, students will be told by their thesis committee that there's a bit of additional work the committee would like to see. And when that does happen at CCS, the senior is told very specifically what additional work the committee would like to see. And I participated every year I was at CCS with one thesis committee or another, and often was involved with graduates who had to do a bit more work and would have up to a year to complete that work. And if it was completed within that time, they would get their degree. I just wanted to add some context there. I don't believe that was relevant at all to Joanna's experience, but just in case. Back to Joanna, quote, my family is very positive about it, very supportive, but we leave it as a piece of fiction. We don't discuss the story. We talk about real events. My friend who experienced it with me has a hard time reading it, believes it is an important story for me to tell. Still quoting Joanna, quote, I've lost touch with the men in the story. Sometimes I'm so afraid of them reading it that I feel panicky, though I had received their permission to write the book years and years ago. If the book ever gets wider readership, there may be a discussion with them, and that will be another part of this bizarre self-reflective journey, unquote. I do want to stress that is a major aspect of autobiographical comics, even beyond the realm of the graphic medicine relevant graphic novels and projects we're talking about here tonight. That is a constant for creators who work in memoir and autobiography. You never know when you'll run into somebody who you portrayed in one form or another, fictionalized or not, in your autobiographical memoir. Joanna also said to me, quote, making this book was absolutely the right thing to do. It allowed me to put it behind me and to lay my ghosts to rest. The object was to create a more open discussion about mental illness, suicide, and medication. I don't know the impact it has had on the readers in this regard, but I've learned to talk openly about my journey and encourage those around me to do the same. Indeed, this is me talking to you now. Joanna's Long Division goes into the impact the medications have on her biologically, as well as emotionally and psychologically. In this, Joanna is building upon the graphic novel and comics work of cartoonists like Phoebe Glickner and Creota Wilbur, among many others. Joanna graphically dramatizes, diagrams, and explores the impact that pharmaceutical and psychotropic drugs have upon her surrogate self in the graphic novel Long Division. As within, so without. In its original thesis form and the later revised, expanded, published editions, Long Division is, quite literally, a far more introspective work in graphic terms than any other CCS autobiographical thesis that I've seen to date. All right, switching gears. Bryn Adams took on an autobiographical thesis chronicling Bryn's own struggles with suicide anxiety and suicide ideation, and it was entitled Emergency Exit, A Recollection. The graphic design for Emergency Exit's multiple cover elements spoke volumes, but the process and the final product proved rewarding. Bryn says, quote, "My worldview in June 2015, when I graduated, was so radically different from my worldview in August 2013, when I started the program at the Center for Cartoon Studies, that it's still almost impossible for me to believe," unquote. I recommend a visit to the Center for Cartoon Schultz Library if you're ever able to travel again in this pandemic. And while you're there, take the time to explore Bryn's thesis project. In Bryn's addendum material of the thesis package, the various attempts to find an approach to this very loaded and potentially lethal autobiographical material is fascinating in and of itself, a process that Bryn documents and provides examples of, including the false starts and the blind alleys. And these are in and of themselves compelling. For instance, here's a couple of examples in which Bryn experimented with using Calvin and Hobbes, approaching it as a variation on Bill Watterson's work, thinking that might provide the distance necessary to work through this. And in Bryn's own words here, quote, "The conceit was ultimately too random and disconnected from the rest of the story and my own style to be used in the final piece, though I'm still pretty pleased with how it turned out," unquote. Bryn's notes in the thesis are articulate and insightful, and quite candid in Bryn's self-assessments, including what it is that attracts and keeps Bryn interested as a storyteller and artist. Quote, "A certain proprietary fondness toward these early attempts at allegorical imagery," unquote, which was ultimately abandoned for a more direct autobiographical dramatization of events, contrary to Bryn's preference for creating, quote, "comics that prioritize symbolism over realism, feeling over thinking, and dreaming over planning," unquote. Emergency Exit indeed dramatizes Bryn's, quote, "personal experience with mental health, mood disorders, and suicidal ideation from high school to what was then the present day," unquote. Working with thesis mentor and advisor Alison Bechdel, creator of the long-running strip Dykes to Watch Out For and the classic memoir graphic novel Fun Home, a perfect match, if I may say so, of student creator and mentor advisor. Bryn worked from September through February just on writing and thumbnailing. And thumbnailing means laying out the completed narrative arc. So the bulk of Bryn's time in that senior year was spent on the writing and laying out the graphic narrative. We're going to be looking at a lot of drawings in a moment. Don't tune out. This meant that much of the final artwork that we saw as a thesis committee would remain incomplete, though Emergency Exit offered a complete read, incorporating as it did all of Bryn's writing and thumbnails. This afforded the thesis committee the opportunity to see much of Bryn's actual process, in that Bryn's process was preserved in the artifact of the thesis itself. And that's part of why I was so eager to share this with all of you tonight. While sharing scans from the thesis Emergency Exit, I also am going to share with you Bryn's 2018 comments about the project, the process, the product, that is the thesis packet, and what followed. Quoting Bryn, quote, "I can honestly say, without a shred of hyperbole, that my CCS thesis changed my life. My worldview in June 2015 was so radically different from my worldview when I started, it's almost hard to believe. A lot of the credit for that transformation goes to the magnificent therapist I had during my second year. But without the simultaneous process of crafting my thesis narrative, working and reworking all of these ideas, receiving critiques from classmates and teachers and my advisors, I really don't think the process I made in therapy would have been nearly as significant or lasting, unquote. By the way, I also want to stress that's one of the other obstacles and tools that presents itself for those creators who either are using a school program like that which the Center for Cartoon Studies offers in its 2-year program, or working professionally with a publisher, with editors and so on, in that you're not only dealing with the self-therapy that you're doing while creating the work, you also have to build the necessary emotional tools to not just cope with, but incorporate and work with critiquing by outside individuals. And that can be really hard for a lot of creators. Back to Bryn's quote, I still struggle with a lot of mental health challenges and likely always will, but I no longer carry all the heavy, ugly, overwhelming beliefs that once made my day-to-day life so hellish. And my thesis has a lot to do with that. Quoting Bryn again, quote, I let my family and several close friends read my thesis in its entirety, which felt pretty scary and vulnerable, but rewarding overall. Again, quoting Bryn, quote, all of the reactions I got were generally positive, but depth of response was mixed. Some folks really engaged with the story, asked thoughtful questions about both the content and the process, got emotional when discussing it, etc. While others simply acknowledged that they had read it and been moved by it and left it at that. This is an example, the next few pages, of some finished pages that Bryn had completed as part of the thesis packet as well. As an instructor, which I was at CCS for 15 plus years, and as a 40-year plus veteran of working professionally in the comics and graphic novel field, one learns to easily read most fellow artists' thumbnails. And if the previous pages were difficult for you to decode, fixing an image in your mind of what Bryn intended the finished pages to look like once completed may help you as I work through sharing a bit more of Bryn's project with you. In the thumbnails, you are seeing the skeletal storytelling elements, including Bryn's lettering. Here is an example of one of the finished pages. Among those pages Bryn brought to completion and near completion was an opening sequence set on a train platform where Bryn seriously entertains leaping onto the tracks a split second before the arrival of the oncoming train. There is another person waiting on the platform, and Bryn is using a handheld digital phone as well. The sequence crosscuts between Bryn's conversation with a party on the other end of the train ride waiting for Bryn, the calm confusion, the calm confusion and conversation with the other passenger waiting for the train arrival, Bryn's nervous body language awaiting the train's arrival, and the environment itself ripe with catastrophic potential. The multi-page sequence is staged with Hitchcockian precision, building to the moment in which Bryn appears to jump. And the immediate reaction of the person waiting alongside Bryn on the platform, and what follows in the seconds after Bryn's leap. Followed immediately with a companion page showing the real world action. Bryn did not jump. There was no suicide attempt. Quote, just, unquote, the ideation of the suicide. In narrative terms, this is a cheat. But in the context of emergency exit, Bryn has made the constant suicide ideation plight concrete, very real, and now very strongly felt because as a reader, we have now experienced it. The real world page could be said to be without consequence. Nothing really happened. But that simply isn't true. It's brimming over with the consequences of Bryn's playing out in the imagination, the suicide as if it had been real. Though a relief to the reader, the corrective page is pregnant with terrible aftershocks, and the final panel of Bryn riding the train is deceptively direct. This is the power of comics. I asked Bryn about the reaction of family members to this thesis. Quote, "My parents' responses were pretty unemotional, almost academic. Gosh, I wonder where I got that propensity to intellectualize my feelings from," which I was a little disappointing, but completely understandable. I realized that suicide narratives are fraught and uncomfortable at the best of times, let alone when they're written from the perspective of your own child, unquote. I asked, given 50-50 hindsight, would Bryn do such a thesis project again? Bryn said, 10-10, would do it again. It was painful and scary and hard, but so worthwhile. Quote, "The only thing I might do differently would be to tweak my process to require slightly fewer steps. Thanks to the very full-time job and various small side projects I now have on my plate, I have limited time to keep plugging away at the final product," unquote. Quoting Bryn again, "There's a part of me that wishes I had looked ahead and planned for more constrained schedule, but overall, I'm really happy with what I accomplished, and I'm working on being patient with my progress." I want to share with you one passage of Emergency Exit that's in very rough thumbnail form. This is a key passage set during the Center for Cartoon Studies school year, specifically September of 2013, in which Bryn takes a walk around White River Junction, Vermont, where CCS is. These thumbnails are spare, but they speak clearly to those of us who know this area. And for those of us who do not, these thumbnails do formalize and dramatize Bryn's spatial relationship with the landscape being explored, including bridges over expanses of water. Quote, "Drowning is a completely ineffective method compared to blunt trauma," unquote. Later in the year and later in the thesis, Bryn's conversation with classmates and peers here, CCS fellow Sophie Yanow, a fellow traveler that during this thesis year for Bryn, play a greater role in the narrative and in the self-therapy process articulated by the thesis itself. With these exchanges, this brings Bryn and the reader to a quietly moving sequence in which Bryn takes a walk with slightly altered perceptions with a group of friends and classmates, culminating in a single textless page, a silent beat, a full page in which the landscape alone suddenly overwhelms the narrative as a landscape without text or internal or external dialogue of any kind. And we have arrived at a point where Bryn is able to savor a place, a time, the world becoming in and of itself significant and incredibly rewarding in and of itself. And this ability to internalize a moment in time, life lived, and then externalize it as the page itself, and then carry on with the narrative, distills the benefits inherent in the expressive externalizing process of Bryn having seen through Emergency Exit to the stage of completion reached during that critical thesis year. Just arriving at the sketchiest of all the pages in the thesis, I can't tell you how moving it was to arrive at this page. A revelatory moment of grace, of harmony with the external world. It's almost miraculous. For me, Brin's loose line, sketchy thumbnail carries enormous power, potential, and clarity. Whatever the respective state of completion, these kind of thesis projects convey worlds within them, expressing lived experiences with generosity and crystalline clarity. These moments, these images, carry such power because of all that has preceded an image like this, providing weight and context. And again, this is the power of comics. This is the potential of graphic medicine, if you will. You may recall a similar moment that I showed you, a similar beat when I was sharing pages with you from Nomi Kane's Sugarcane, used in a very different context to a different emotional point. But it does strike a comparative grace note, the point in which the protagonist finds, pun intended, a sweet spot. Maybe, after all, this can be lived and lived with. There is a way to survive. I can only find a way to function in this world. And if I can find a way to function in this world, I can experience this world. Nomi Kane has continued work in this vein with a strip entitled Why Healthcare Matters. This is published on the Nib, July 3rd, 2017, and it builds directly upon Nomi's thesis project, Sugar Baby. It challenges the then current president and administration's attack on the Affordable Care Act, the punitive conservative misperceptions and misconceptions and myths about, quote, pre-existing conditions, unquote, and the current state of affairs for countless Americans under our current healthcare system. Nomi says, quote, I have a bottomless well of outrage for the way people with pre-existing conditions are mistreated and milked for profit by insurance, big pharma, and overworked hospitals. And I don't have the option to walk away from it. So yeah, I'm sure I will continue to cover it, unquote. Let me conclude this part of the talk with you tonight with our oldest alumni, Albie Wesolowski, who I'm very proud to say is also a good friend. Interviewed by the Online Comics Forum in March of 2014, when Al was the retiring manager editor of the Journal of Field Archaeology, but still art editor of that publication. When Al was asked about his work in archaeology and archaeological themed comics, Al said, quote, I try to inform readers that archaeology is not just about fabulous discoveries or being pursued by giant stone spheres or agents of the Illuminati, but more about people trying to carry out field work in places they might never have otherwise visited. Archaeologists have a curiosity about the past and its material culture that is quite at variance from the depictions of, say, the Indiana Jones stories. Our challenge can be to find interesting ways of presenting the realities of fieldwork. My tendency is to concentrate on the human interest side of things, but comics are capable of dealing with most everything on the more scholarly side as well. I like the way the cartoonists present themselves, often as bemused observers willing to go along for the ride. This approach, I think, generates both interest and goodwill on the part of the reader. The tone is not didactic or rarefied, but more of a, hello, want to hear a story? Feeling that makes the reader a participant in the unfolding tale, unquote. The page at right is an example of the kind of comics work that Al has been doing off and on since he graduated with an MFA from the Center for Cartoon Studies in 2008. And by the way, if you're interested in finding out more about Al, he is one of the students prominent in the documentary Cartoon College, which is available in streaming, online. You can buy it on Blu-ray, DVD, and so on. And yes, this is a blank screen. I must briefly return to the anxiety-inducing for some blank white page to explain to you something about Al. Earlier on, I mentioned my longtime friend and fellow Swamp Thing artist, inker John Totleben, who suffered and suffers from vision issues. Here is what I told Al Wesolowski back in 2018, while visiting him in the hospital. I said to Al, quote, John Tolman suffers from similar symptoms as your own. What he has is, I'm now quoting John's wife, Michelle Tolman, retinitis pigmentosa with Usher's syndrome. Usher's version causes the bilateral nerve deafness that John suffers from. And John, like Al, wears hearing aids, uses a cane, and so on. And I said to Al, like you, John still draws, unquote. And Al replied, I do not believe that I have Usher syndrome, which is, as Michelle says, associated with RP, usually striking in the teens and causing loss of visual field, night blindness, and hearing impairment. In my case, the deafness is thought to have resulted from a high fever from meningitis when I was an infant in Araby, Louisiana, just downriver from New Orleans. The symptoms of RP manifested themselves in my mid and late teens, with night blindness beginning and a narrowing of my visual field. I first noticed that I did not see hands preferred for handshakes, so I did not respond in kind. RP in my case seemed to stabilize in my late 20s with an increasingly narrow visual field for a few more years. I gave up driving when I was about 40 and should have stopped a few years earlier. My central vision had remained pretty good and is still at 20/40 today. My recent worsening of my vision from being legally blind to low vision was caused by my cavalier attitude to my glaucoma medicine over the last year, owing to major depression. I have retinitis pigmentosa, an inherited retinal dystrophy that progressively destroys the retina of both eyes, resulting in poor night vision, reduction of the visual field. In many cases, people with RP lose all their vision in their 20s. Mine stabilized then, and I did not progress to blindness. The loss of visual field gave me legally blind status when I was about 40. By way of comparison, most people have a visual field of about 230 degrees. Mine is 7 degrees, giving me tunnel vision. So I have very little peripheral vision. I'm night blind. I can see very little unless there are street lamps. Dark restaurants and cinemas are pretty much impossible for me to navigate with safety. Okay, and this is relevant for those of you interested in how this impacts a cartoonist. When I draw or read comics, I cannot see an entire panel at a time. Only maybe a third of the panel is visible until I shift my eyes around. This makes it difficult to draw since I cannot see the entire figure at once, a condition that has prevailed for some 30 years caused by RP, unquote. For your information, my friends, that is the very same difficulty my friend John Tolman faces when drawing today. He can only see the portions of an image, a page or a panel, a figure. He cannot see the entire figure he is drawing. And John was expert at drawing the human and, as you know, as a Swamp Thing reader, the inhuman anatomy. But now he can only see portions of the figure. This causes distortions in anatomical proportions. So bear all this in mind as we share, with Al's enthusiastic permission, 5 of Al B. Wesolowski's drawings. These cartoons I'm showing you now were drawn by Al in 2018, on July 22nd, 2018, in fact. Al says, quote, "These cartoons resulted from art therapy as part of the recovery program from depression at Dartmouth Hitchcock Medical Center in Lebanon, New Hampshire, and very close to Hanover, New Hampshire, where the Dartmouth Medical School is located. I threw myself into the recovery program, attending every session and activity and discussion. The first day I was instructed to go to art therapy. My immediate reaction was, that's stupid. I can barely see, let alone draw. But the therapist said, you're a cartoonist. Bring a cartoon. I used markers to draw the first of the Defiant Blind Cartoonist series. Bring it on. The result was better than I thought it would be, although it's pretty rough, but I think I'll improve when I have proper equipment, such as drawing table and light box, good dark pencils, and rapidograph or dip pens. After the first drawing, Al told me, quote, at subsequent art therapy sessions, I drew 4 more, trying to see the humor in the matter and not dwelling on the sense of despair and loss that was the case at the beginning. As the days passed and the therapy sessions besides those for art met, I found tools for dealing with depression and my spirits lifted until my rating of depression on a scale of 1 to 10 dropped from 8 to 2 over the course of just several days. Also, I was taking an antidepressant medicine, and that doubtless helped when it became effective about 2 weeks into my hospital stay. After the hospital, I went to an assisted living place to continue recuperating for a few weeks until I was able to return to my condo in White River Junction. Al says, quote, my recovery from depression continues and I'm actively making plans to return home, which, by the way, Al did get to return home and lives there now, unquote, and resume drawing the series. I plan on having enough art to self-publish a mini for distribution to the medical community and public health venues. I doubt that a commercial publisher would be interested in the series, but who knows? That first drawing was a turning point in my recovery. I could still draw, sort of, and the work gave me pleasure as I struggled through the drawing work and decided that the perfect is the enemy of the good. And I contented myself with the rough nature of the drawings in the series. I had planned at the outset of my hospitalization to give up cartooning, give my art supplies and art cartoon related books to the Center for Cartoon Studies. I'm still donating much of my unused supplies purchased in anticipation of projects that my depression prevented me from starting, as well as reduce the size of my personal library. I can still read normal books, albeit a little slowly now. Reading several books a week was a lifelong pleasure of mine, but I'm still coming to grips with my present difficulties in readings. Al concludes by saying, I plan on continuing to draw cartoons and print up minis using the CCS Print Lab, to which I have access as an alumnus, and not obsessing over my indifferent skill at drawing. Just get the work out there, warts and all. And if it should prove too difficult and dispiriting to draw, I'll find something else to be creative, but I think I'll stick with the cartooning, unquote. And I'm with you, Al. Pencil me in. Special thanks to James Sturm, the Center for Cartoon Studies, David Lloyd, Kyler Hedlund, who's with the class of 2019, Sam Glansman, Drew Ford, Tom Fox-Marnick, and above all, Bryn Adams, Ken Dahl, Nomi Kane, Joanna McDermott, Manny Murphy, and Al B. Wesolowski, who let me share this material with you tonight. Let's take a break. I can take some questions if folks have questions. And I hope this proved useful and perhaps even a little inspiring to some of you.
Yeah, Stephen, Dylan asked while you were doing your presentation a little bit earlier, he says, does graphic medicine only pertain to those dealing with mental or physical illness, or can it encompass those dealing with not so much as illness, but emotions, anger, regret, etc.?
It can deal with anything, okay? Graphic medicine can deal with anything. It's a loose knit, you know, all genres have labels, and those labels are permeable and always evolving and changing. So yeah, graphic medicine, to my mind, goes with any terrain that involves some measure of introspection and self-therapy. Of course, the academics at the official graphic medicine conferences probably have very nuanced definitions that I'm not getting into with you tonight. But it's one of the reasons that I deliberately chose a selection of work from CCS alumni that involve not just physical, physically manifest forms of illness, but also emotional issues. To me, it's all fair game, and memoir is all encompassing. And I have to say, if it wasn't clear to you with my presentation, I'll say it flat out now. I consider anyone who takes this stuff on incredibly courageous and brave. I stated right at the beginning that I think it's generational, that, my generation, I mean, I was among classmates who wanted to draw Batman, Wonder Woman, and Spider-Man. Things have changed quite a bit, in part because we're now, a couple or 3 generations into cartoonists who grew up reading memoir and these kind of works. So I hope that answered the question. More questions?
Yeah, Stephen, we got another one in here, and it was from SFT, Steve Tuckey. And it has to do with when you're talking about libel or with the way that you represent people. So he says, I'm wondering what kind of difference there is in the terms of duty of care for folks doing text-only memoir versus graphic novel memoir, as there's also the concern for how you portray people in images as well as words. Does that make graphic novel memoirs more difficult or open to legal problems than, say, just a text format?
Boy, that's a great question. I am not a lawyer. I am a lay person as far as the law goes. I have a fair amount of experience after 40, 50 years of dealing with contracts, but that does not make me a legal expert by any means. You know, one of the perils of memoir is you have a right to tell your story. Nobody can stop you from telling your story. That does not mean that people involved in your story may be happy with how you tell your story or how you portray those around you. I'm sure it's one of the reasons that Joanna, for instance, was convinced by their thesis mentor that they should fictionalize what they were going to be working on. One of the reasons for being advised to fictionalize was to provide the distance necessary for even wrestling the material into shape. If you're doing this as a thesis project, as the people I just shared with you did, the clock's ticking. You have a year. And the purpose is to graduate. The purpose isn't to successfully complete self-therapy. But all of these issues of how you portray other people, how that may involve down the road slander or libel laws and so on, you know, it's not just relevant to graphic medicine. I mean, you know, I'm struggling right now with how to approach a couple of my book projects that are autobiographical in nature. And when I'm writing about, for instance, the experience of working on Swamp Thing in the 1980s, I'm talking about a lot of other people, including, you know, people who were my employers, my editors, creative partners, people who were impediments to the process. And at a certain point in any of these things, you make a decision of, all right, I'm going to fictionalize it because I don't want to complicate my life with what this person might say or do, versus, fuck it, this happened. I've got enough documentation. Let them take me to court. And a lot of that hinges on the bent of your nature as an individual, how confrontational you are or are not, et cetera, et cetera. When you're doing it in comics form, yeah, it brings a whole lot of baggage to the, you know, to the process and possibly to the aftermath. But take a look at, I mean, if you've never read any of Harvey Pekar's American Splendor, take a look at American Splendor, because that comic is full of the people that Harvey knew, the people that Harvey worked with. And, you know, they even adapted it into a feature film in which some of those people appear, as well as actors playing those people appear. That's how brilliant American Splendor as a film is. So, you know, you are not the first to walk this path. And you will certainly not be the last. And that is among the potential minefields and risks that are out there.
Well, Stephen, we have a question from Hannah McKee.
Yes, bring it on.
She said, can certain graphic medicine pieces relate to more than one mental or physical illness of different natures? Which means that one time, can you include multiple, I guess, lineages in your description?
The sky's the limit. I mean, Al Davison covered multiple levels, just what you're asking about, just what Hannah is asking about. You know, Al Davison's graphic novel, you know, Al had such complications and such a multi-layered experience of physical illness, physical disability, emotional issues, psychological issues. The sky's the limit. And it really comes down to, can you deal with it and coherently tell the story, or do you have to narrow it down in order to tell any story or any aspect of your story? So I'd say, as with almost all work in comics and all genres in comics, it really depends upon your intention, your purpose, your skill set, and how large or small your canvas is. Okay, if you're dipping your toe in the water by doing a 12-page story as your first experience as a creator of telling part of your experience, of course you cannot get into all the complexities of your life the way you could if you were working on a 500-page graphic novel. But I stress to you that if you can't get that 12-pager done, you may never get your 500-pager done. You know, so it really comes down to what's the story you wish to tell, and what are the constraints you're working within, whether those constraints are self-imposed or externally exposed, limited page count, a limited time frame, what have you. Part of why I presented to you all tonight what I presented to you tonight is these were all creators working with a ticking clock. They had 1 year to complete their thesis project. And that also meant I could effectively communicate to you about 4 or 5 people, right? Because I was just dealing with presenting to you in some condensed form the experiences of a single year of their life. I could not do that with Al Davison's work, where, if you remember, I showed you a cover and 2 or 3 pages and we moved on because there was just so much else to that graphic novel. Does that answer the question, Hannah, Stephen?
I would assume so. I mean, Hannah would have to pipe in here, but I assume that's what she was asking. I assume that's sort of like load question, like how much can you take on? Just like when you're writing any story, what is the level at which you want to take the story to keep the people engaged without doing too much?
Well, or I mean, a lot of times these graphic medicine narratives involve disorienting the reader as much as the individual telling the story suffers with disorientation and so on. So it's really a question of, you know, what story do you want to tell and how do you want to tell it? I am adventurous enough as a reader or a viewer that I love things that pull the rug out from under my feet. And I'll hang with something, even if after 5 or 6 pages, I'm going, what is going on? You know, and if that is absolutely essential to relating your experience with some sort of a medical or psychological or emotional situation, hey, bring it on. You know, we all subject ourselves to insanely complex and convoluted experiences just to sit through a Matrix movie. So if you're going to take me there to tell me your story, I am far more willing to go with you on your story, because your story will matter more to me, just as at least a human being is telling me a story instead of, I don't know, some boardroom or something. So I do have to deliver that caveat. You know, a lot of people are concerned about, oh, I don't want to confuse or lose my reader. My God, look at our pop culture right now. Think about how many movies everyone around the world sits through that would have been incomprehensible 10, 20, 30 years ago. And now we go for that ride.
Hey, Stephen, there's several questions out here that are really good. And I don't know what Abu's is yet. So what I want to do is maybe would it be okay if we forwarded you some of these questions?
Oh yeah, I can answer stuff.
And then you could answer them, because there are like about 4 or 5 good ones that I know would be very probably long answers.
Sure.
And I know we still got a little ways left. So
we can also come back to them at the end if time permits. But yeah,
okay. Yeah, I mean, there's like ones that are personalized. Well, I mean, they're good. I don't know how to get them into one. I'm having trouble getting them into one question, though they're all related. So what I thought we'd do is we've answered a bunch from the chat. So we'll go to Abu, and then I'll make sure that I record these somehow if we don't get back to them. Right. And then that'll allow us to get on to the next piece. But these are a lot of students here that want to know some of these answers, and it looks like some people are interested in trying the process, and they might need a few.
I'm happy to do it. I'm happy to do it. And if there's students from a particular classroom, like Stephen Tucky's, Stephen can also Zoom me into his classroom at some point to continue the conversation. So
Cool. And it may be some of Diana's students too. So
That's fine. I'm
one of
open
our
to
other
it.
professors is on here. Okay. So at that point, I'll have Abu go, and then I'll look in copying these and getting them so you can answer. So go ahead, Abu.
Hi, Steve. Happy New Year, by the way. Happy New Year,
And to
everyone.
you.
Thank you. So my question was now looking back to underground comics. Like, do you consider, the creepy ones, like the creepy comics that Robert Crumb did, like his work as graphic medicine, like him exploring his sexual fantasies and all that? Do you consider that a graphic medicine? And what kind of reputation will the artist have? Like, if I want to do something about a sexual fantasy, what sort of reputation will the artist get? Would it be like, oh my God, stay away from here? Will
Well,
that happen?
that's a really good question. Judging by how my students were reacting to Robert Crumb starting around 2016, I'd say reputation is something to be concerned about if you're going to put sexual fantasies down on a page. For my generation, reading Crumb's work in the 70s was liberating, was taboo busting. And it's not because I in any way, I don't emulate, I don't look for role models. And I think this is relevant to the field of graphic medicine. None of us are reading graphic medicine in order to, I want to experience leukemia, We're not looking for role models. We're looking for empathic doors. We're looking for windows into people's lives, because understanding, I'll go back to Nomi Kane's project that I shared with you all. Nomi Kane wants people to understand what it's like to grow up with type 1 diabetes in the narrative of Sugar Baby. That is not sharing a sexual fantasy or a personal fantasy. That is sharing a life experience. But I think, relevant to your question, Abu, I don't read Sugar Baby because I want to pattern myself or my life after, Nomi Kane, even though I think Nomi is an incredible person and a very noble and brave person. So I'm not threatened by what I read in comics. And there is a generational shift going on where people seem to be threatened by exposure to images, thoughts, ideas, belief systems that they don't share or don't even want to share. And I'm not sure exactly what surrounds all that, but it does mean that, to answer your question, Abu, you are part of a generation where, yes, there may well be editors and readers out there that if you share something a little too personal, they're going to go, okay, I'm done with this. I never want to read another comic by Abu. On the other hand, there are creators who have built their entire careers on sharing their deepest, darkest fantasies. I don't think that I can say with any degree of accuracy or perception that, yeah, that does, or no, that doesn't fit the definition of graphic medicine. But I will say that the tools that the cartoonists who share their deepest, darkest fantasies with are very similar to the expressive tools that a lot of graphic medicine creators use, right? That's part of why I showed you some of the comics I showed you tonight. And that's also why, I'll give you a specific instance. I use the term Hitchcockian, referring to Alfred Hitchcock, when I showed you that 3 or 4 page sequence from Brin's graphic novel involving the ideation of suicide on a subway platform. And I believe my use of that term, Hitchcockian, is accurate. But that also denotes that cartoonists like Brin are adapting the narrative tools of creators like Alfred Hitchcock and Brian De Palma, whose work in no way would be considered part of graphic medicine. But the storytelling tools, the narrative devices, the iconography, the pacing, what you show, what you don't show, is entirely relevant to graphic medicine. In fact, I would argue that in a lot of ways, the ground zero of exploring where the narrative tools of graphic medicine in comics and graphic novels comes from would be in the work of Will Eisner, The Spirit, because that was one of the first comics in the 40s that would spend panels and pages so that you would feel the agony of the spirit struggling through the desert heat, where his lips are cracking and he's overwhelmed with fever and so on. Those are graphic tools that are used today by people who are doing works that are defined as graphic medicine. And I would also say the same goes for a lot of the pre-code horror comics and the EC Comics creators, including one of the EC horror stories that I mentioned in my lecture that's on the ConCon website about the history of the pre-code horror comics. There's an EC horror comic story that was in the Haunt of Fear about a woman who keeps fantasizing that her doctors turn into monsters. And she goes through these horrible experiences that are her fantasies of the psychotherapy techniques that they're using on her. That's an example of a horror comic that most people involved in graphic medicine might even get angry with me for bringing up. But I would contend that those narrative devices are devices we have seen since the 70s in the work by Sam Glanzman and Justin Green, using it to a different end. And that's my very, very long answer to your short question, I believe.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you very much. So I did get several questions down, and then there was just one general question, but I'll put it down here. But they
Go
were
ahead,
people were curious about historical comic references, because they were kind of starting to draw some stuff from Joe Sacco.
Oh yeah.
Art Spiegelman, and I'll throw that down as a question too. So I'll close the questions with there, and then I'll throw that down here. And if we got time at the end for a couple,
great.
and then
And we'll
otherwise
go
I'll
back
send
to
them to
it.
you. And I want to tell you that's way cool for you to be willing to zip into somebody's classroom and to describe those things. That's very
my
very
pleasure.
kind of you.
Also, I mean, if you send me the questions as a text, I can answer them in short form as an email, and you're free to share that with everyone that's on the email list for the lecture tonight. So
Sweet.
there you go.
Awesome. Thank you.
Cool.
I'll get one more.
Does anyone need a bio break? I'm okay. I'm ready to go when you guys want me to go to the next. And should we even do the Swamp Thing lecture? That's my next question for you.
I don't know. What do people want to do? We start out with about 30 folks, and we have about 20.
Okay,
folks.
If people want to stick around, I'll do it. If not, I can save it for another time. We have been here for a fair while.
What kind of time frame are you talking about, Stephen?
I don't know, half hour, 40 minutes. Your call. I'm ready.
I want to do it, sir. I also
Abu will say.
Okay.
Well, I don't hear anybody else saying they don't want to stay.
Okay, so here we go.
Here we go.
Let's jump into
Anything
it.
with the demon, I'm in. I'm
the
in.
Demon, yeah, big time with the demon.
With the demon, I'm in. Let's do it.
Here we go. All right, let me see if I can do this without freaking out the whole system. Slideshow. Play from start. Okay, can you see the title card?
Yep.
Great.
Yes, sir.
Here we go. View, presenter view. Okay, and once again, I'll be consulting my notes. Please bear with my not looking directly at everyone. Okay, whatever your illusions about any fame or fortune associated with comics in the 21st century, please understand that back in the 1980s, freelancing in American comics could be a lean and at times very mean circumstance, about as it is now in the 21st century for most creators, in fact. While we were overjoyed to be working at all, and even more overjoyed to be working on a regular freelance gig on a monthly comic book title for one of the major publishers, DC Comics, the page rates were modest. Even for the time, we were getting the lowest page rate that DC paid at the time. The work was demanding, and there were absolutely no perks from our employer, save for the satisfaction in a job well done and whatever fleeting notice one might earn from ongoing work on a monthly periodical title. So what was possible working in American comic books on a monthly comic every 4 weeks? Exploitation or exploration. Now, you must forget the mega billion-dollar comics franchise, movie, and TV bonanzas of the 21st century. This was the 1980s. You must forget how major book publishers bankroll graphic novels these days. The term graphic novel wasn't even a decade old when we were working on Swamp Thing, and hardly a market force to be reckoned with. Comic books, what my students were calling floppies, if and when my students would refer to them at all, comic books were still the backbone of the American comic book industry. And I have to add, when your backbone is called a floppy, you know you're barely standing up. Know also that the internet and email as we know it didn't exist yet. There were no home computers, no scanners, no cell phones, no digital means of production. All the production on the comic books was done in the DC offices, and they were all hands-on processes. Fax machines were unwieldy and weren't yet commonly accessible to lowly freelancers like ourselves. Physical scripts, photocopies, and original artwork had to be moved through the mail or via UPS or Federal Express to and from home studios to the DC offices. In the case of the Saga of the Swamp Thing, scripts had to be mailed from the writer's abode. That would have been Marty Pasco living in California, or after Marty left the book and Alan Moore took over scripting, Alan Moore living in Northampton, England. They would be mailed from their homes to New York City. Original script pages or photocopies were then mailed or expressed to and from DC editorial, to and from the penciler, which was me on this issue, these 3 issues of Swamp Thing I'll be talking about. They then had to be also expressed or mailed to or from the letterer, the inker, John Toddleben in this case, and the colorist, Tatiana Wood in this case. This had to happen as quickly as possible at all times, every day, every week, every month, without fail. Every 4 weeks, we plucked ideas from wherever we could get them, including, in this case, from the DC Comics universe, specifically this creature you've been staring at, the Camera, which was created by Jack Kirby in the early 1970s run of the comic book, The Demon. So The Demon was a Jack Kirby horror comic that was published starting in 1972. And the Camera was introduced in a single story in The Demon. In fact, his entire lifespan in the DC universe was this one issue until we brought him back for Swamp Thing. The Camera was this white little lemur looking creature that in its own form looked harmless, but it could embody whatever your deepest, darkest fear was. That's what it could appear to you as. And it didn't feed on physical food, it fed on fear. This creature, this story was told in The Demon #4. The cover date was December 1972, meaning it was actually on the newsstands in October of 1972, right around Halloween. Cover dates referred to when the comic would come off the newsstand, not when it would go on. And the story was entitled The Creature from Beyond, and it was the tale of the Camera. Now, I never forgot this story. In fact, I'm a huge fan of Jack Kirby, and I'm a huge fan of the Demon comics. And this was one of my favorite issues of the Demon. So years later, 1983, in fact, when I had a shot at working on Saga of the Swamp Thing, I included the Camera in one of the lists of story ideas that John Tolliban and I put together. Now, John and I had rushed a package of story suggestions to Marty Pasco, and I still have a photocopy of what we sent Marty Pasco. It was dated March, April 1983. And it included the following plots that did eventually find their way into the series, Saga of the Swamp Thing, but not until after Marty Pasco's departure. We shared the same plots and other ideas with Alan Moore once he was on. Here's a quote from what we had sent Marty. Quote, "An appearance by the demon is necessary when an overzealous but sadly inexperienced student of the black arts conjures up the camera, the fear monster, see Jack Kirby's The Demon #4. Using its abilities to embody the victim's deepest fears, the camera scares his conjurer to death and so is left free to wander the swamps, feeding on its reign of terror. Swamp Thing is confronted by the beast and meets his match." Now, once Alan Moore had taken over the scripting duties after Marty Pasco left on Swamp Thing, Alan proved even more receptive to John Tolliban's and my story suggestions. And in a letter from myself to Alan Moore that was dated July 19th, 1983, I proposed to Alan the use of a child's drawing or a series of child's drawings as a means of telling a story. And here's a quote from that letter I sent Alan. Quote, "With lush Tolliban inking sharing page space with a 4 or 5-year-old boy's drawings, perhaps using the boy's innocent, scratchy drawings to depict the story's most fearful visuals might be tastefully effective," unquote. I also thought it might be a way around the comics code, right? If the scariest things Alan came up with in the story were presented in the form of a child's drawing instead of, my artwork and John Tolliban's artwork, we might get away with more than we would have otherwise. Now, given Alan's immediate solicitation for our ideas, John and I rushed Alan a carbon copy of the story suggestions we'd mailed to Marty Pasco earlier that same year. Our earlier demon story arc had already evolved by the time we resent it to Alan into the nasty notion of the camera insinuating itself every night into a place like Green Meadows School, where my wife, Nancy, who I will now refer to as Marlene because she changed her name to Marlene, where she worked, where the camera would embody the inarticulate fears of autistic children and feed off their intense emotions. More on this shortly. While some of our story concepts didn't make the cut, many did, including the Demon Camera storyline, which became this 3-issue arc, fleshed out by Alan into scripts that fulfilled and went beyond our wildest nightmares. This work remained uncredited at DC's insistence. The trade-off that John Tolliban and I negotiated was that DC would occasionally reimburse John and I for phone charges we were racking up calling each other and the very expensive long-distance calls to Alan Moore in the UK. Again, remember, this is before the internet. So AT&T owned everything, and we were charged by the minute for our time speaking to Alan and my calling John Tolliban in Pennsylvania, him calling me in Vermont. In the short term, this seemed like a workable compromise, but it has had long-term consequences in devaluing John Tolliban's, Rick Beach's, and my own contributions to the collaborative work, which was indeed more than, quote, just drawing the series, unquote. John, Rick Beach, myself, we contributed a lot of story ideas and character ideas to the mix. Now, in Saga of the Swamp Thing number 25, entitled A Time of Running, we meet the demon's human alter ego, a man named Jason Blood, or a sort of man named Jason Blood. And Abby meets Jason Blood, and they talk in a cafe. And Blood tries to warn Abby about a danger threatening the School for Autistic Children where she works, a place called Elysium Lawns. Abby's reaction is immediate and very telling. "How dare you? Isn't there even a corner of my life that's safe from all this weirdness? I don't know who you are or how you know about me, but you just keep your hands off Elysium lawns. It's a reaction that displays a stronger sense of character, an inner anger and power that we haven't seen from the character before. Abby, as a female supporting character, has been dependent on the men in her life, from her uncle, Uncle Arcane, to being protected by Matt Cable in early issues and by Swamp Thing. Alan Moore shows us a more sensitive side to Abby in his earlier issues as a writer on the series, and he suggests that Abby is a character who cannot cope with the realities of what is happening to her, such as her husband Matt's abusive nature and Abby's disgust over Swamp Thing's devolved state, which would have been in the issue number 22. And yet, Alan Moore very cleverly set us up for a switch. This is a development in the character of Abby in which we meet a stronger, self-reliant, more rounded, adult, and believable female character. So in the narrative, Alan, myself, John Tottleben, we introduced that Abby has a brand new job at Elysium Lawn Center for Autistic Children. And Alan frames this three-part story with Abby and Swamp Thing's midnight run to Elysium Lawns as the means for setting this narrative in motion. It's one of those stories where you join the story with action and then you go into flashbacks to give the backstory that led us to this moment. And this introduces Elysium Lawns as the primary setting for the conflict which will follow. And it also introduces a flashback to Abby's job interview at Elysium Lawns and her first day working there, meeting autistic children who live there and dealing with their sometimes extreme behavior. Okay, so as Alan Moore himself stated in Comics Interview number 12, as we were beginning work on this 3-issue story arc, this narrative was based on John Tottleben's and my plot proposal, and the setting was based on Green Meadows School on Stowe Hill in Wilmington, Vermont, which is where my first wife, Marlene O'Connor, had been working since 1981. In fact, it was because of the work opportunity at Green Meadows School with autistic children that Marlene and I moved to the Wilmington area. This, by the way, is the only photo, one of the only photos I could find online of Green Meadows School. Now, Marlene was working at Green Meadows, a boarding school for autistic children that was situated up on Stowe Hill Road, which was also had one of the more scenic views in that part of Wilmington. It was great to watch sunsets from up there. And it was this setting that inspired the Demon story. Marlene even arranged for Alan to visit Green Meadows School back when Alan Moore visited Marlene, myself, and our kids in August of 1984. As Alan himself wrote later that year, quote, "Vermont is beautiful, just woods, mountains, isolation, and clean air. The time I've spent in Vermont is probably the most relaxing and pleasant of my entire trip. Vermont might as well be another planet." Okay, so this is the best aerial photo I could find online of Green Meadows School. Green Meadows School, as I'll relate to in a few moments, no longer is Green Meadows School. This property has changed and changed hands. It's no longer a home for autistic children. When Marlene was working there, it was set up as Green Meadows School because a group of parents from outside the state who had autistic children were frustrated with the fact that they could not find adequate care for their children, particularly educational care for their children. And they formed a collective, purchased the land, and established Green Meadows School. It was a very unusual experiment in and of itself. And what I'm showing you while I'm talking to you about a few other aspects of this is the state records I could find for Green Meadows School. Now, even with Marlene working a full-time job at Green Meadows, and my working on a monthly mainstream comic book title, albeit one near cancellation, Saga of the Swamp Thing was almost canceled with issue 19. And one that never earned any of us royalties during its run. We have since earned royalties every quarter from DC Comics starting in 1988. Once they started collecting the work in paperback form, we earn royalties, but we were not earning royalties when we were doing the work. Marlene and I were living just below the state of Vermont's definition of poverty level in terms of income. In fact, we were fortunate once our kids were born that Vermont participated in the special supplemental nutritional program for women, infants, and children. It was called the WIC program, W-I-C, and we were eligible. Those weekly deliveries of milk and dairy goods kept us all fed during the lean, mean weeks between paychecks. Now, you need to understand that once Alan Moore was on board as the writer of Saga of the Swamp Thing, starting with issue number 20, it was how we all lived. Alan and his first wife, Phyllis, John Toddleben and his wife, Michelle, myself and Marlene. It was how we all lived that pretty much informed Alan's characterization of how our heroine, Abby, lived. How Abby lived, her employment ups and downs, living paycheck to paycheck, wearing t-shirts and cut-off jeans, her existence revolving around a swamp monster that the neighbors weren't to know about. Yep, that was us, pretty much. In more ways than you can possibly fathom, Swamp Thing reflected how we were living in those days, individually and in our respective married relationships. Of course, we weren't dealing regularly with the Walking Dead, Hellspawn, demonic possessions, and the Monkey King, but it's a pretty accurate dramatization of how we were all living at the time. Okay, now let me talk a little bit about autism. And it's difficult to talk about what I've put up on the screen. For those of you that want to read all the text on the screen, this is not what I'm going to read aloud to you. I'm going to relate some other information to you. This is a study entitled Autism Spectrum Disorder Reclassified, a second look at the 1980s Utah UCLA autism epidemiological study. And it was this study that I found that discussed how autism would have been defined during the period of time that Marlene was working at Green Meadows School. So at that time, this is how they defined autism. It was a disorder that required a total of 6 or more items from 1, 2, 3, with at least 2 from 1 and 1 from 2 and 3. Qualitative impairment in social interaction is manifested by at least 2 of the following: marked impairment in the use of multiple nonverbal behaviors, such as eye-to-eye gaze, facial expression, body postures, gesture to regulate social interaction. Failure to develop peer relationships appropriate to their developmental level. A lack of spontaneous seeking to share enjoyment, interest, or achievements with other people. Lack of social or emotional reciprocity. Qualitative impairments in communication as manifested by at least one of the following: delay in or total lack of the development of spoken language. In individuals with adequate speech, marked impairment in the ability to initiate or sustain a conversation with others. These were the kids my wife Marlene was working with day in, day out, 5 days a week. These were some of the kids I got to know, some of the higher functioning autistic kids at Green Meadows. As I mentioned earlier, we did get to treat to, you know, an outdoor barbecue, take them to a movie, take them out for ice cream and so on. So I did get to know a few of these kids. And there's more conditions related to autism. And since this lecture is being recorded, rather than read all this to you, I will leave it to you that you can go back to the recording if you want to find out more of this information, and you can pause it and actually read this material. So autism, very real thing. It was part of Marlene's day-to-day life. And as a result, it was part of my own and my family's day-to-day life. And I'll also add that not all, but many of our friends were from the working community at Green Meadows School. And that also meant that many, many aspects of the life at Green Meadows spilled over into our day-to-day and our evenings in other ways. So when it was decided by Alan, with the approval of our editor at this point was Karen Berger, that we would be doing the 3-issue story arc set at Elysium Lawns, it was my job to come up with a cover design. And I won't bore you with all the details, but the cover editor at DC at the time was a really wonderful cartoonist named Ed Hannigan. Ed could be a rough character to deal with, but I would always submit multiple multiple cover concepts to editor Karen Berger, because I knew she had to go over them with cover editor Ed Hannigan, and then they would settle on what the final cover would be. These are 2 of the pencil drawings I had done among, I think I did 5 roughs in all. And they finally settled on this cover design. This is a scan of the actual original art for the cover of Saga of the Swamp Thing number 26. Now, a good portion of the Demon Camera pencil pages were completed and FedExed to Karen Berger from the road, because at the time I was drawing much of the three-issue arc. My parents, my wife Marlene, and our 1-year-old daughter Maya Rose took a trip from my parents' home in Northport, Florida, across the Florida Panhandle into Bayou country, all the way to Houma, Louisiana. Alan Moore had designated the real town of Houma, Louisiana, as the setting for Swamp Thing. I'd never been there. The research trip was undertaken under my own impetus after readers wrote to DC Comics noting the many inaccuracies in how I was depicting the Louisiana setting. Like everything we did, the costs were our own to shoulder. DC did not help bankroll this trip at all. In fact, Karen Berger was quite angry with me that my family and I were taking this trip at all. This wasn't a trip funded by our publisher, but the research photos and the research materials that I gathered in triplicate, one set for me to keep and use as reference, one set I could mail to John Todleben to use for reference, and one set I mailed all the way to Alan Moore in the UK at my own cost, served the 3 of us very well. My set of research materials were eventually passed on to Rick Deach when Rick took over art duties on the series. And I would have donated that material to one of the university libraries my collections are going to. But Rick, when cleaning out his studio when he was done with Swamp Thing, threw it all out. Now, don't be mad at Rick. Don't forget, he did not leave Swamp Thing or DC under particularly favorable work conditions. So I'm sure him throwing out all the research materials was part of the purge. Let me get this shit out of my life. But yeah, it does frustrate me at times that all that stuff went that route. Anyway, so let's talk about the character of Paul, the autistic boy at the heart of this 3-chapter Swamp Thing tale. Paul was based in part on some of the Green Meadows children that I had come to know. Though, again, I say, for obvious ethical reasons, I avoid basing my visualization and characterization of Paul on any individual, living or dead. Paul was a composite creation, if you will. He was a composite creation comprised of some of the Duxbury, Vermont kids I'd grown up with and gone to school with when I was a kid, who in later years might or would have been identified as autistic or on the spectrum. But when I was in elementary school in the 60s, that designation didn't exist. And Duxbury Elementary School certainly didn't have any form of therapist or psychologist available to it. But I'm a cartoonist. I'm a creature of the pop culture. And I was also drawing from the pop culture I had grown up with. For instance, this Canadian documentary entitled Warrendale from 1967. From the film's opening shots, we're introduced to a particular program designed to help traumatized kids make a successful reentry into mainstream society. There's nothing in this film provided in the way of background information on any of the people involved, neither the adults who are working at Warrendale or any of the children. We simply see each person in the documentary functioning in the role assigned to him or her, and it's left up to the audience to try to figure out how all these people fit into the system and so on. But for me, it was the pop culture I'd grown up with on television that really played a major role. For instance, the very same year that the term autism was first introduced in the English language, and I've given you the name of the professional and the context in which that term autism was first used in 1943. That same year, a film produced by Val Lewton on the RKO Studios lot began production in Hollywood on August 26, 1943. The shooting continued up to October 4th, but the director, Gunther von Frisch, was behind schedule, was fired by RKO, and Val Lewton's film editor, a man named Robert Wise, was slated to complete the feature. So additional shooting was scheduled in the week of November 21st. And this gave Robert Wise his first directorial credit. And by the way, Robert Wise went on to direct The Haunting, Sound of Music, West Side Story, and many, many, many other big Hollywood films you've all grown up with or know without knowing it. So why am I talking about Curse of the Cat People? Well, in the paper that was published in 1943, it was a description of 11 children with striking behavioral similarities, including autistic aloneness and insistence on sameness. And the story of the Curse of the Cat People follows the death of a man's wife, Irina Dubrovna. And his wife, Irina, had been the protagonist of the very popular 1942 horror movie, The Cat People. It was the story of a woman who believes when she's angered or aroused, including sexually aroused, she would turn into a big cat and kill. And The Cat People was a huge success, in part because it was very ambivalent in confirming for the audience whether Irina was delusional or actually did turn into a big cat. So in the story of Curse of the Cat People, that widower, a man named Oliver Reed, remarried his co-worker, Alice, and they now have a 6-year-old daughter named Amy. And they live in Tarrytown, New York. And the father worries because Amy has a very introverted personality, and she has a predilection to fantasy, behavior that reminds him of his dead wife, Irina. And he now believes that it was Irina's madness that drove her to death, that she was not really a cat person. At the urging of her parents, Amy attempts to make friends with neighborhood children, but neighborhood children want nothing to do with her. While walking through the neighborhood, Amy pauses in front of a big house in which other children claim a witch lives. But actually living in there is an elderly woman who beckons Amy inside. And Amy becomes involved with this woman and her dejected daughter, a woman named Barbara Fenton. Now, the crux of Curse of the Cat People is that Amy's only friend is the ghost of Irina, the cat woman from the Cat People. So here is, I would argue, Hollywood's first portrayal of autism or on the spectrum behavior. But the kids who were autistic or on the spectrum that I grew up with tended to be little boys in various crime films and fiction films. There's little Bobby Driscoll, who played the protagonist of The Window, a 1949 film I saw on TV more than once. This is based on a short story by Cornell Woolrich called The Boy Cried Murder. And it's about a little boy who can't help but lie. He's constantly making up and telling stories. And he sees a murder committed. He's the only witness to the murder, and no adult believes him except the murderer. Another favorite film of mine growing up and novel were these two novels and the film adaptations. These were very important influences on me. These are both published in 1953. Now, going back to that same letter that I wrote to Alan Moore from July 19th of 1983, I proposed in that letter to Alan, quote, in relation with this demon camera story idea, A quote from James Agey's screenplay of Davis Grubb's Night of the Hunter, a line spoken at the end of that very fine film by Lillian Gish, is something we could use. Yes, for every child, rich or poor, there's a time of running through a dark place, and there's no word for a child's fear, and no ear to hear it if there was a word, and no one to understand it if they heard. God save the little children. They abide and they endure, unquote. I'm even kind of choking up saying it to you because I love that movie so much. Now, perhaps I said to Alan, this device could be used to tell the demon camera a tale, with the camera at one point personifying our hero child's most nameless fears. And perhaps it would better spin a different tale you might have in mind, I said to Alan, unquote. Now, these were novels I read from the time I was a preteen, and I still own them, and I still reread them every number of years. And these are two films that I absolutely love. Night of the Hunter from 1955, with Robert Mitchum as the murderous preacher or fake preacher who's stalking these two orphan children, and The Fool Killer. It was made into a film in 1965, co-starring Anthony Perkins. It stars a very young child actor named Edward Arnold, as a Civil War era orphan who is wandering the deep south of America after the Civil War. And he stumbles on a wounded veteran who has had some sort of head wound or trauma. And the kid comes to believe that this mentally impaired veteran may be the legendary fool killer he's heard about. Now, there were other films that I'd seen on television or in theaters that also shaped my characterization of Paul. On the spectrum, characters included the 11-year-old boy Francois, traumatized by his mother's death, in the French feature film La Promesse, which I saw on the CBS late movie as Secret World. And the boy was played by Jean-Francois Vérec. In many ways, let's go back. In many ways, this kid from Secret World was my unconscious model for Paul. This is something I only realized later in hindsight. It was a film I'd only seen once on late night television and never again. There were no photos or stills of the movie I'd ever seen. So whatever I drew from this character, I drew from memory, from that one memory of seeing the film on television. There were other models. A young actor named Philip Frayne had his one and only screen role playing Tommy, the little boy who's sort of the Renfield character in The Return of Count Yorga from 1971. He's sort of the vampire's assistant who keeps luring adults into the reach of the vampire Count Yorga. And Tommy isn't per se autistic, but because he is under the influence of Count Yorga, his behavior is often quite on the spectrum, and he lives at an orphanage. More famously was the Conrad Aiken short story, Silent Snow, Secret Snow. It was a school study classic that we had to read in junior high and high school. It was first published in the Virginia Quarterly Review in October of 1932, and it tells the story of a 12-year-old boy named Paul Hausleman, whose withdrawal into an imaginary world of snow is the crux of the story's portrayal of his retreat into madness. There was a almost forgotten 1966 short film version made of it in black and white that I saw in junior high school, which prompted, our teacher showed us the short film in class and then had us read the short story, and we had to discuss it. But most Americans first experienced the dramatization of the story when Radami's Para played Paul in the Night Gallery episode, Rod Serling's Night Gallery, Silent Snow, Secret Snow, broadcast October 20th, 1971, narrated by Orson Welles. By the way, this kid actor is best known and might be a little familiar to some of you. Without his hair, he was Grasshopper on the TV show Kung Fu, the younger version of David Carradine's character Kane. So anyway, those are the pop culture sort of role models that were somewhere in the back of my head when I designed the physical look of the character Paul. So on her first visit to Elysium Lawns, Abby meets Paul. He's a disturbed young man whose parents have been killed, and Paul obsesses with words being spelled correctly. And that's because Paul's parents had used a Ouija board, and his mother had misspelled the word camera, which inadvertently summoned Jack Kirby's The Demon Camera, which is now living in Elysium Lawn, attaching itself to Paul and traveling around Elysium Lawns at night and feeding off the fear that it generates in the children who live there. Now, part of my characterization of Paul wasn't just how he looked, it was also how he moved. With the permission of Marlene's closest friend at the time at Green Meadows School, Karen Lennon, who is the woman depicted in panel 3 here on the right, she appeared in the comic as the woman who interviewed Abby for her position at Elysium Lawns. And Karen Lennon was happy to be in the Swamp Thing comic. Fellow Green Meadows employee, the late Michael Anderson, drew some of the child drawings of the camera of the Monkey King for this story. The drawings here on this page from the story, the top 3 panels, were drawn by Rick Veitch's son, Ezra. I paid both Michael Anderson and Ezra their portion of the page rate I was paid for the panels that their childlike drawings appeared on. And this was Ezra's first paid work. He let me know he's still very proud of this, and quote, "This was my first venture into comics," unquote. Ezra is still drawing comics and also a musician. So the flashback in our story fully dramatizes the death of Paul's parents. This is how the page looked in black and white, scanned directly from the original art. This is how it looked colored by Tatiana Wood. And after the camera killed Paul's parents, it snuggled up to the petrified Paul, feasting on his fear. And then Paul becomes the camera's entryway into Elysium Laws, where it feeds every night on the fears of Paul's classmates, if you will. The Autistic Children's Home serves as a banquet hall for the little creepy camera. Notice I incorporated the Francesco Goya image, which provided the first chapter's title, The Sleep of Reason, into that page. A writer who loves Swamp Thing and has written about the Swamp Thing series online, named Andrew Edwards, wrote about this sequence back in 2012. I'll quote Andrew, quote, "The scenes with the children and camera are incredibly disturbing, and the creative team in DC Comics were extremely brave for allowing their controversial content. Moore really taps into human fear here, and he pulls no punches. Roberta's fear of the infant sibling she smothered unintentionally is heartbreaking and almost too horrific to contemplate for a reader. A ghostly baby arm is enough to establish the sense of horror visually. Michael's fear of cancer, a concept he cannot understand, manifests itself in a type of monstrosity found in the works of H.P. Lovecraft," unquote. And continuing Andrew Edwards' description, quote, "Jessica's fear of being abused is given form in a deranged, hideous manifestation of her abuser, who slurs, 'Mommy needn't know.' Everyone who sees camera sees only what he or she fears. Their perception of him is subjective," unquote. And that's from Andrew Edwards, A Time of Running, at the Sequart website, SEQART, posted September 19th, 2012. Together, Alan, myself, John Toddleman, and Tatiana Wood delivered the requisite monster action: Swamp Thing versus the demon, Swamp Thing versus the camera. And in the end, brave little Paul finally conquers his fear over the camera via confrontation with and conquest of his own fears. And the demon Etragon finally makes a snack of the camera, ending its reign of fear. And as far as I know, and please correct me someone if I'm wrong, because if I'm wrong, I'd love to read wherever he came back. I don't think the camera ever returned to the DC universe after this. Again, I could be wrong. I don't read every DC comic. So I just want to go back to this page for a moment to remind you all that the personal experience that informed this this story in this comic, turned out it wasn't just my first wife Marlene's working life at Green Meadows School. It also turned out to be strangely prescient what Marlene would be dealing with a few years later, and what Marlene, myself, and my entire family would be dealing with from that time to the present day. Her own memories, recovered memories of abuse, and that colors all our lives in our family. Hopefully we, like Paul, will find a way to overcome and conquer the emotional shock waves that we were all dealing with, each in our own way. And I have to say that I still have a lot of fun drawing these characters. Here's some of the sketches I've done for fans over the years of Etrigan the Demon, the Camera, and you know, it's a lot of fun for me to revisit this stuff and go back there. So that's my talk for tonight, folks. I want to send special thanks to my first wife, Marlene O'Connor, to my incredibly tolerant current wife, Marjorie Bissette. And here's some of the references that I made. I'll leave this slide up for a few moments in case there's questions. And before we're done, I'll also jump to the special thanks slide that I always put up for the sponsors of these lectures and the sponsors who allowed me to put together earlier forms of this presentation tonight. Okay, I'm yours for questions, one and all.
Well, we'll be able to take maybe a question or two. I mean, we're at the 2.5 hour mark, which is
that's
stretching
nothing. That's
which is-
nothing, Stephen.
it's stretching it for my recording capabilities,
Okay,
my
understood.
poor computer. But if we have a question or two, we'd be happy to field those questions. There was one that came up in the chat for sure, and it was an observation that Natalie made about how interesting it is that a lot of the portrayals of autism really surround autistic boys, and how many women and girls who have autism kind of go undiagnosed, and wondering if that's something that, you know, kind of factored into either your experience or, you know, working on the comics, whether that ever played a role.
That's a great question. As a matter of fact, part of why I inserted into this lecture and did a bit more research, part of the reason I kicked off the discussion of pop culture influences with a couple of slides about Curse of the Cat People, is that when I presented this lecture to my students, one of our students at CCS, who self-identified as being on the spectrum, was a woman. And she asked, you know, why is it only boys? It was, the decision was rooted on two things. Number one, it was based on the fact that at Green Meadows School, most of the students there were male. Not exclusively. There were, as I recall, I can picture and think of the names of at least two female students that lived at Green Meadows, but the bulk of the student body there were male. And because of the nature of whatever the rules and regulations were with the state concerning Green Meadows, they only could stay there up to a certain age. And then they would have to, you know, the family would have to set up other living situations for them. So, you know, I can't speak to, I don't remember ever having a conversation with Alan Moore about, you know, whether that autistic child should be a boy or not. That was what Alan scripted. And you'd have to ask Alan if that was derived from research or personal experience. I have to say that because of time constraints, and as Stephen noted, we've already gone over time, I did not refer to other female characters in the pop culture that would be considered autistic or on the spectrum. Of course, I limited myself to pre-1980 pop culture because I drew the story in 1983. There have been many since, and I would steer anyone interested to the incredible book, House of Psychotic Women, written by Kirla Janess. And it's a fantastic book, in part autobiographical, in which Kirla charts her life story with how the depiction of, for want of a better word, mad women in the pop culture, particularly horror movies, played such a vital role for her in her life growing up, including therapeutic roles. So House of Psychotic Women by Kirla Janesse. Her last name is spelled Janisse. And that entire book is just about female characters and how they're presented in the pop culture in the context of Kirla's own parts of Kirla's own life story. So I would recommend that to the person asking that question.
Excellent.
It's a
Thank you.
great book, by the way, just a great book.
Terrific. We've got time for one question. Abu, you want to have the last question before we're all done?
Yes, sir. My question was there any other influence you had, like any director influenced you while doing those horrifying panels, showing that baby hand and the lady's horrified expression?
It just came out of my head. You know, I was working with very little photo reference. If I recall, well, okay, bear in mind, I mentioned to you that a lot of that artwork was done on the road. And I mean, you know, Marlene and Maya would be sleeping in the motel room in the bed, and I would be in the bathroom with the light on, hunkered down the bathtub with a drawing board, not sleeping, but drawing, so that in the morning when my family headed out, I could pop the pages into a local FedEx, you know, drop ship point, and then I would sleep in the car for a stretch of the way. That's how a lot of those pages were done. So those images were just pulled out of my head, Abu. I mean, I didn't even have photo reference to work from. By the time we did this story, I mean, this was Saga of the Swamp Thing 25, 26, 27. John and I had been working together on the book since issue 16. So I no longer needed the kind of research crutches I needed earlier in the run, where, you know, I would need photos of Sigourney Weaver to be able to draw our version of Abby. By this point in the run, I could freehand draw our Abby. Like, she was in my head by this point. And I don't believe any of the characters in this 3-issue run were based on, you know, any living person. The ones that were based on our friends at Green Meadows, I could draw them out of my head from memory. You know, I mean, Karen Lennon was one of our best friends. We spent tons of time with these people who also worked at Green Meadows, so I could draw them out of my head, including Michael Anderson, who does appear in the comic story. So all the weird stuff that you're asking about, Abu, that was just out of my brain pan. You know, I would
probably sleep deprivation. Right?
Exactly.
Hey, you know, when you're drawing horror comics, sleep deprivation can be a powerful tool.
Oh yeah.
So it was like drawing your own dream, like you saw this
Yeah,
in your dream.
yeah. Although I have to say, Abu, at the time I really wished I was asleep and dreaming, but that was not anything that was going to happen. My editor,
the curse of the starving artist, huh?
well, and staying on top of a deadline of a monthly book. I was always behind deadline, always. And these 3 issues are 3 issues where there was no help from Rick Beach. In part, as I said, they were drawn, a big chunk of these were drawn on the road. So, you know, also, these are all characters I loved. I mean, drawing the demon, holy shit, was that fun. I still love drawing Etrigan. He's such a fun character to draw. And the camera, you know, I could draw in my sleep. to go back to, you know, the sleep deprivation issue. So there you go. Hopefully that answered the question. Yeah, it was all out of my head, Abu. That was all out of my head.
Indeed. Well, we're gonna wrap it up for tonight because it's getting late, and I don't know if you can hear my dog in the background is playing with a toy and reminding me, hey, what about me?
Hey, take me outside.
Exactly.
Hey, everybody, stay warm. It's
Yes.
about 0 degrees here in Vermont. I'm sure it's colder elsewhere. Please stay safe. Thanks for coming. I again remind everybody that the website has all these lectures archived and recorded, so feel free to share and get the word out there. And Stephen, what's our next presentation?
Indeed. Thank you for mentioning. On Tuesday, it's a Tuesday, the 25th of January, so 2 weeks from today, we've got our next session that's going to be at 7 p.m. and that's all about comics prehistory. Comics prehistory. Where did comics come from? Did they just form fully out of the ground? No.
Rich
We're gonna
vein of
learn.
comics. Look, I struck it rich.
We're going to learn all about comics prehistory with our, I'm going to call him professor because he's professor to me.
Yeah, you're a professor.
Professor Stephen.
Professor,
Bissette.
professor.
Yeah, exactly.
You know,
Thanks for being here tonight. I really appreciate it, everybody. And stay warm, and we'll see you on the 25th.
Yep. Bye.
good night, all. Good night.